This demonstration will show you how to paint water lilies that float on top of the water while still providing a view to underneath the surface. The main focus is perspective, especially in relation to the lily pads, but I'll also give you a brief rundown on all the other aspects of the painting. As usual, I try to explain my reasoning techniques along the way so that all the information will be much easier for you to remember.
If we haven't met yet, then hi, I'm Jen from Blue Beach House Art. I teach painting through clear, detailed and easy to follow video lessons so that anyone can create a life they love as an artist.
For this tutorial, I'm going to jump straight to the fun stuff, covering the canvas with a first layer of paint. Let's start with the sand on the bottom of the lake. So I'm going to mix some cadmium yellow with titanium white to create a very pale sand tone. Now, objects that are underwater usually have a blue or sometimes green hue. So I'm going to add some Pthalo Green to this mix to cool it down. The colour still looks a little too bright, so I need to tone it down with some brilliant magenta. Now it's almost the same colour as my grey palette. I've covered the bottom third of the canvas with the grey-green, but as I start to move upwards, more towards the background, I want to start making the colour darker and greener. So now I'll add more Pthalo Green to my paint mix. We're not aiming for a smooth blend because the sandy bottom of the lake is likely to be an uneven surface. Keep adding more Pthalo Green to the mix as I move up the canvas. I may need to add a little magenta as well if the colour starts to look too pretty rather than dark. Now I want this colour to get really dark, but brilliant magenta won't allow me to do that because it actually contains some white in the tube. So I'm going to switch my red to Napthol Crimson. Once I reach the top, I begin to shift the colour more towards blue by adding some Pthalo Blue instead of Pthalo Green. What I'm trying to create is the feeling of distance. In water, everything appears bluer and darker as it recedes into the distance. Add a few more dark blues around the edges at the bottom to give the faint impression of some rocks there under the water. That is our water foundation. The darkness will act more as an undertone at the top of the canvas rather than the main colour. The main colour is going to be blue, which I'll add over the top of this once the paint has dried. The blue I'm going to add is cerulean blue, mixed with some white. It will represent a reflection of the sky colour, which is how we can see the surface of the water. The sky blue colour starts to fade out from about a quarter of the way down the canvas. And by the time I reach just about the halfway point, the sky blue has pretty much faded out completely. Now the foundation coat is done, and it's time to move on to the next step, essential elements. And those are the water lilies. We know a lily pad is round, so the temptation is to always paint it that way. When you look at these two side by side, however, you can get a clearer idea of just how much difference there is in the shape. Making the lily pads at the top of the canvas smaller and flatter than those in the foreground uses lines and shape to make them appear further away. That is the linear perspective. There are two types of perspective to consider, linear and atmospheric. Now I would strongly suggest sketching in all the lily pads here, exactly as they appear in the reference photo, to make sure you get the linear perspective correct. You can trace, use a grid method, or the multiplication factor method I teach in my painting courses, whichever drawing method you find easiest and most accurate. Now the nearest water lily is the largest, so I start with my largest round brush and cover the lily with a nice even coat of permanent light green. That is, with no white added. Actually, on second thought, I'm going to change to a smaller round brush because I want to get those fine crinkly edges, and a large brush might be a bit clumsy for that. The crinkles on the front edge should be larger than those at the rear. Moving to the next water lily. Colour is another visual tool we can use to make the lily pads at the top appear further away than those at the front. That is the atmospheric perspective. Sometimes it's called aerial perspective, but I guess when we're referring to water, atmospheric perspective would be the more correct term. A paler and slightly bluer version of green is used for each lily pad as we move up the canvas towards the background. Using the existing mix, I add the tiniest bit more cerulean blue and some more titanium white. I want the green we're using to appear warmer than the background colour, which means it's not as close to blue. If I use the same cool green for the lily pads as we did for the underwater background, they would also appear to be underwater. The way I like to remember which colours to use in this situation is that objects above the water will always appear warmer because they are in the sunlight. Now notice that I've skipped the large lily pad in the middle. That's because this one is underwater, so a cooler version of green will be needed. I'll come back to that one later. So I continue to move up the canvas and backwards into the painting, making the existing paint mix slightly bluer and slightly paler with each new lily pad. Even when there are two leaves sitting right next to each other, I'll still make the colour of each one slightly different so that they will stand out from each other. Now I can go back and fill in the underwater lily pads. What you're looking for is a green that looks more bluish or cooler than the one we mixed for the lily pads on the surface. Two of these leaves are still curled up, so they're quite different in shape and colour. I've painted the underside the same green as the other underwater lily to the right. Then I leave a gap and paint another rounded edge with just a thin line of the same colour. The area in between will be in shadow, so a darker colour will be needed. Now this mix contains much more of the phthalo green. I'll use a similar process for the other curled up leaf. There'll be lots of sunlight and shadows on here, but I just want to get a feel for the shape of it at this stage. Before going any further, I want to start blocking in the lily flowers. These are going to be shades of white and purple, and because I want them to stand out well against the background, I'll start with the white. I'm using a medium round brush on the back row of petals first. And notice that some of them are outside the darker bottom part of the flower. The front lily is viewed from a higher angle, so we're able to see into the centre of the flower. I start with the rear petals again, but this time leave a small round area in the middle for the centre stamens. Before starting work on the front row of petals, I go back and add some purple to the back row. My purple is made from ultramarine blue and brilliant magenta, and I tone it down a bit with some white to make a nice mid-tone lilac colour. Try to avoid making them all look the same. Some have purple on both outer edges, some only on one edge, or perhaps just the top half. Now I can define the front row of petals on each flower. firstly by painting with a white base coat. For those at the rear, the petal shapes are roughly the same as the back row. The large lily at the front, however, is seen from a different angle. The petals in front of that centre are viewed more from the top, which means the shape will be sort of short and stumpy. The purple on the front row of petals should be brighter than that of the back row. This is what will make them appear further forward. For the rear flowers, the difference in tone is only slight, but on the front flower you can increase the intensity of the purple quite a bit. The central part of the front flower starts with some cadmium yellow light. This is the highlight colour. I've added a small touch of the yellow at the very bottom of each flower also. And the stamens in the centre of the flower can be shown by few strokes of orange. The orange I used was made by mixing the cadmium yellow light and the brilliant magenta. Finally, a few strokes above and between the orange ones with purple will create the shadow. Purple is the complementary colour to yellow, which is why it makes a great shadow colour in this instance. The base colour, or mid-tone, for the flower stems is a similar green to that of the lily pads, cerulean blue and cadmium yellow light. For the shadow side of those stems, I mixed some Napthol Crimson with Pthalo Green, so that the colour leans a little towards the crimson. Now those stems in the background should be a bit paler than the ones in the foreground, so use a little white there to tone those colours down. The crimson and green mix can also be used for the stems that are beneath the surface, but for those, make the colour lean more towards the green. Now, there's lots of underwater stems all over the place in this painting. I'll block them in now using this same colour mix. They may look too prominent at the moment, but they will be faded out as necessary in the next step. For now, I want to get back to the lily pads. The leaf veins on the lily pads are an additional way to show distance in this painting, because the way they are painted onto each leaf will help to show the linear perspective. Starting at the bottom of the canvas, I run a single line of bright cadmium yellow down the centre of the largest lily pad using a small round brush. Now, each half can then be divided into 3 sections by painting 3 lines outwards from the central point. The lines stop just a little short of the edge. Now, each of those 3 sections are then divided into 3 again, and I make a little fork at the end of each one. A few additional short branches are then added along either side of each line. Make sure to stagger them so that each one starts from a different place. This will break up these green shapes in a nice even fashion. Then simply repeat the process on the other half of the lily pad. Moving up the canvas, skip the underwater leaves for now and focus on the next one back, which is up to the left. Some white has been added to the cadmium yellow to make it slightly paler, and I use the same process again of creating 9 sections on each side of the central line. This time there's an opening on both ends of the lily pad, but the one with the straight lines and sharp corners is the one we want to start from. Now continue to move up the canvas using the same process for each lily pad, making the yellow colour mix a little paler each time. Ignore the underwater and curled leaves for now. Remember that when only part of a lily pad is visible, you may not need to paint every single line because some will be hidden. and try to make the lines thinner with each successive lily pad. Switching to a smaller brush can help with that. The opening may not be in the same position on each leaf, so your central line may travel in a different direction. The process remains the same, however. Now the shape of the top lily pad on the right is quite narrow because of the perspective. This means the central line is situated almost at the top of the leaf, and the veins on the far side are not completely visible. Just paint the ones you're able to see. The difference between light and dark, or the tonal range, is less in objects that are underwater than those in the air. That's atmospheric perspective again. Therefore, I'm going to use cadmium yellow without any white added to the mix to paint the veins on those lily pads that are underwater. Remember that not all of them are visible on the curled up leaf, so you'll have to use your imagination to figure out which parts can be seen. For the curled up leaf that is above the water, I'm simply going to add some light and dark tones to show the curvature of the leaf. The upper side is the same as the base colour green that we made earlier, slightly bluer than the lily pads further down the canvas. A slight shadow is painted on the upper side of the leaf in the part that's hidden from the sunlight. This is a darker and bluer version of the same green, and a tiny touch of the Napthol Crimson to tone it down to a shadow colour. On the underside of this curled up leaf, I have added a little more of the Napthol Crimson to create a deeper shadow colour. A very fine line of highlight colour is then added to the edge of this curled up leaf. It's the same colour as the veins in the other lily pads, cadmium yellow with some white added. Now the veins can then be added to the upper side of the curled up leaf as well. I'll deepen the shadow a bit first with some of the green mixed with crimson for better contrast. The leaf veins are then added to the sunny part of the leaf with that same yellow and white mix, and I'll extend the veins a small way into the shadow area. Now speaking of crimson, I'm going to add some to the top surface of my lily pads as well. So far 2 colours have been applied to each one, but according to my tricolour method, a minimum of 3 are needed to make them look real. Watch how the front lily pad comes alive when I add a touch of crimson around the edges and in between the yellow veins. The colour I'm using is a mixture of the brilliant magenta and Napthol Crimson. If you have the quinacridone magenta, that would be a good choice instead. As I move up the canvas, I make the magenta a little bluer by adding some of the cerulean blue, and a little paler by adding some titanium white. And I continue to do this for each lily pad to maintain that feeling of distance that is the atmospheric perspective. The ones at the rear really don't need much of this dark colour at all, just a few spots. Now when it comes to adding the dark tones to the underwater lily pads, I make the colour bluer but not paler. That's because atmospheric perspective makes everything underwater appear bluer and darker in the distance rather than lighter as it does in the air. The lily pads are sitting on the surface, but most of their stems should appear to be underwater. At the moment, they look too prominent. The way to sink them into the depths is to make the colour contrast less with the underwater background. I still want them to appear 3-dimensional, however. For those that are underwater, I've used some permanent light green on the top and right-hand edges of each one. That is the highlight, and it's applied to the edges that are closest to the direction the light is coming from. Identifying the light direction and then keeping it in mind throughout the whole painting helps me decide which colours to use and where they should go. Now the paler green tapers out as the stem goes deeper into the water because less light will be able to penetrate there. For the stems that are sitting on the surface, I've used either pink or orange to show the highlight on the parts that are out of the water. Now, spreading a few bits of these warmer colours around the canvas will balance out all the cool greens and also help to draw the viewer's eye all the way around the painting. Once all the essential elements are in, we can start fine-tuning the details, which is step 3. This is mostly about 2 things: defining edges and correcting tonal relationships. Now, some edges that you may need to fine-tune in your painting are the ends of the petals on the lily flowers, both at the rear and the large one at the front. They really should come to a nice sharp point. The reflections of the lily flowers. These are a slightly distorted mirror image of the underside of the above flowers, and they will be brighter than the underwater stems. Flower stems that are above the water. More contrast here makes it clear that they are above and not beneath the surface of the water. Which brings me to tonal adjustments. As mentioned earlier, objects beneath the surface should have a smaller tonal range or less contrast than those sitting on the surface. So if I now increase the contrast between the lily pads and the water, they'll look more like they're floating on top. At the same time, I want to reduce the contrast between the underwater stems and lilies and the background colour so that they will sink further down to the bottom. Now, to make this adjustment, I'll cover the entire background with a slightly watered down version of the shadow colour made with Pthalo Green and Napthol Crimson. Now, I've made this colour lean more towards the green. This transparent layer, known as a glaze, will make the background darker without covering over the details I created earlier. The darker background is where we can see through to the underwater world, so it should only extend about 2/3 of the way up the canvas. Above that, the surface of the water will be visible, which, if you remember, should be a reflection of the sky. More contrast equals more impact. So I'm going to lighten up the top sky reflection a bit to create some contrast with the underwater background. The colour, you should remember, is cerulean blue with some titanium white added. Remember that acrylic paint goes darker as it dries, so make the colour a little lighter than you think it should be. You'll need to paint carefully around the edges of all the lilies and their reflections, but go straight over the stems. We want those to be less visible because they are beneath the surface of the water. The sky reflection colour can be faded out as you move closer to the point where the underwater world becomes visible. A few small touches can add a final wow factor to your painting. For example, make the lily pads stand out more from the background by adding a shadow around the edges. This would be the shadow that the lily pad casts onto the surface of the water. Maximum contrast equals maximum impact, so I'm using my darkest version of the Pthalo Green and Napthol Crimson mix. If you imagine the crinkled edges, some parts would sit above and some on the surface of the water. I'm going to apply this dark shadow only to the parts that are sitting above the surface because they are the only ones that would have a shadow visible. The darkest dark, sitting directly adjacent to the lightest light, is how you create the most contrast. Therefore, I'm going to lighten the edges of these lily pads. I can even go a little further and extend the lighter colour along the ridges that run towards the centre of the lily pad. Now this lily pad appears to have a bumpy surface rather than being totally flat. You may not necessarily want to do this, I'm just giving you some options. A little ring of darker colour surrounding the centre stem of each lily pad will create the impression of a small depression there, adding to the three-dimensional nature of each leaf. And finally, a few small touches of white on either side of each flower stem will show the point where they break through the surface of the water. Now, the hardest part of any painting is knowing when to stop. If you're a perfectionist like me, the temptation to keep fiddling is almost irresistible. I am going to call it time on this one though, to avoid overworking it. Key points to remember from this tutorial are: lily pads will appear smaller and flatter as they recede into the distance. Objects underwater are bluer and darker than those above the surface. When the surface of water is visible, it shows a reflection of what is above. And a minimum of 3 different colours are needed to make objects appear three-dimensional. You can read more about painting underwater scenes on the Blue Beach House Art blog. Or for more in-depth instruction on painting water that looks transparent, I suggest my Wicked Wave Painting workshop. You'll find that on the Blue Beach House Art School course website. Links to both of these resources can be found in the description of this video. Thanks for watching.